You have 5 minutes to clear your things. Security will escort you. My name is Isla Voss, and for 15 years, I've been the invisible architect behind Westmere Global's most lucrative deals. But invisibility, I learned, doesn't guarantee immunity. The Sterling Hall's private dining room had been transformed into a fortress of corporate power. 12 CEOs from different continents sat around the mahogany table, their combined net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. The chandeliers cast honeyed shadows across contracts I'd spent 8 months perfecting. Every clause, every comma positioned with surgical precision. The air smelled of aged leather and anticipation. That particular cocktail of tension and triumph that precedes billion-dollar signatures. I stood at the head of the table, my tablet displaying the final presentation slides. The CEO from Tokyo nodded approvingly at the distribution framework. The pharmaceutical giant's representative from Zurich had already uncapped his Mont Blanc. Even the notoriously skeptical Norwegian executive seemed satisfied, his fingers drumming a rhythm of approval on the pristine tablecloth. Then Victor Langford entered. 18 months into his tenure as Westmere's CEO, Victor moved through spaces like a man who'd learned leadership from motivational podcasts. His Italian suit cost more than most people's cars, but it couldn't disguise the desperate hunger in his movements, the need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. Gentlemen, he announced, though 3 of the CEOs were women. Before we proceed with this momentous occasion, I have an organizational update. My fingers stilled on the tablet. This wasn't part of the agenda. Victor's eyes found mine across the room, and I saw it then. The calculated cruelty of a man who mistakes theater for power. Ms. Voss, your services are no longer required at Westmere Global. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Someone's coffee cup clinked against its saucer. The Oslo executive's drumming stopped. Security is waiting outside, Victor continued, his voice swelling with manufactured authority. You have 5 minutes to collect your belongings. I felt the room's energy shift, not toward Victor, but away from him, like iron filings repelling from a reversed magnet. These weren't people who respected public executions. They were architects of quiet coups, believers in boardroom dignity. The pharmaceutical executive slowly recapped his pen. Mr. Langford. The Tokyo CEO spoke first, his English deliberate and cutting. Ms. Voss has been our primary liaison for 3 years. She speaks our language, literally, in my case. Change is necessary for growth, Victor replied, pulling out prepared soundbites like a blackjack dealer flipping cards. We're bringing fresh energy to our international partnerships. Ms. Voss's replacement is already here, ready to seamlessly continue these negotiations. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Edenford's skyline glittered with false promises. I remained standing, my hand steady on the tablet, watching Victor destroy himself with every word. He gestured toward the door where, presumably, my replacement waited, some eager MBA with a semester of international business and no idea that in this room, trust was the only currency that mattered. The MOUs, the Zurich representative said slowly, examining her copy as if seeing it for the first time. They're quite specific about the signatory requirements. Victor's smile flickered. Minor administrative details, nothing that can't be adjusted. But I saw the Norwegian executive exchange glances with his legal counsel. The woman from Dubai was already texting someone. The careful architecture of trust I'd built over 15 years, every late-night call, every crisis averted, every cultural nuance navigated, began to reveal its true power. 5 minutes, Ms. Voss. Victor repeated, louder now, as if volume could substitute for authority. I closed the tablet with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the silence that followed. 12 of the most powerful people in international business watched as I gathered my things with unhurried precision, my leather portfolio, my Mont Blanc, a gift from the Zurich team after the Basel breakthrough, my personal phone. The security guard at the door looked uncomfortable, apologetic even. He'd eaten lunch with me in the company cafeteria just last week, sharing pictures of his daughter's graduation. As I moved toward the door, I heard the subtle symphony of dissent beginning behind me, chairs shifting, papers rustling, the whispered consultations between CEOs and their advisors. Victor had wanted an audience for my humiliation. He was about to get one for his own. The voice sliced through the private room like a blade, where amber light gleamed off crystal glasses and 12 CEOs sat poised to sign MOUs worth $1.9 billion. I had orchestrated this entire scene, every handshake, every carefully placed document, every strategic pause. And here, at the most critical moment, the man who wanted to destroy me had chosen the perfect stage. But he didn't know that this very act was the trigger for the counterstrike I'd embedded months ago. The first time I saved Westmere Global was in Buenos Aires, 2009. The Argentine government had frozen our assets over a tax dispute, and our then CEO was ready to abandon the South American market entirely. I was 23, supposedly just there to take notes. Instead, I spent 17 hours in a stifling government office, switching between Spanish, English, and broken Portuguese, building bridges with mid-level bureaucrats who actually held the power. By dawn, our assets were released. The CEO never knew my name, but I learned something valuable. Real power never announces itself. Geneva, 2014. A pharmaceutical merger worth $400 million was hemorrhaging on the operating table. The Swiss were offended by our American team's aggressive tactics. The Germans wanted more control. And the Japanese felt disrespected by the seating arrangement. Yes, the seating arrangement. I reorganized the entire negotiation structure, implementing a rotating leadership model that gave each party their moment of precedence. We closed the deal in my hotel room at 3 a.m., using napkins to draft the initial framework because the conference rooms were locked. My husband was calling repeatedly. I didn't answer. By the time I got home, he'd already packed half his things. The Cape Town Marathon, that's what we called the 27-hour negotiation session in 2018. A mining rights deal that would secure Westmere's rare earth mineral supply for the next decade. The South African delegation trusted me because I'd spent months learning not just their language, but their history. Understanding why certain words carried weight, why certain gestures mattered, when their lead negotiator's mother fell ill mid-session. I arranged for a private jet to get him to Johannesburg and back, never mentioning it to Westmere's board. He signed the deal wearing the same clothes he'd worn to the hospital. Each victory had cost me something. My marriage dissolved completely after Geneva. I missed my father's 70th birthday during the Seoul Technology Summit. My sister stopped inviting me to family gatherings because I'd canceled too many times. But I told myself it was worth it. I was building something, becoming indispensable. Victor Langford arrived at Westmere like a hurricane in an expensive suit, Harvard MBA, a string of Silicon Valley disruptions on his resume, and the board's mandate to modernize our approach. Where I built bridges, he built walls with glass windows, transparent barriers that let you see what you couldn't reach. His first all-hands meeting featured a holographic presentation and words like synergy and paradigm shift, repeated with religious fervor. Isla, he'd said after that first meeting, his hand on my shoulder in that practiced way of men who'd taken weekend seminars on leadership presence. You're a treasure. Old guard. But treasure. We need to talk about transitioning your institutional knowledge to the new generation. Old guard, I was 38. For 18 months, I watched him dismantle relationships I'd spent years cultivating. The Tokyo partnership nearly collapsed when he insisted on video calls instead of in-person meetings, a grave insult to traditionalists who valued face-to-face commitment. Our Brazilian contacts stopped returning calls after he sent a junior associate who couldn't pronounce the company president's name correctly. Every fire he started, I quietly extinguished, maintaining the fiction that Westmere was still the reliable partner they'd always known. But I also watched the signs. The subtle reorganizations that stripped my oversight, the new hires who reported directly to Victor, bypassing my division entirely. The meetings I wasn't invited to, then wasn't informed about, then discovered only through calendar accidents. He was building a parallel structure, one where I didn't exist. My assistant, Marcus, had been with me for 7 years. Former Navy intelligence. He noticed patterns others missed. 3 weeks ago, he'd forwarded me an email chain he'd intercepted. Victor discussing my retirement package with HR, planning the exact timing of my removal. The Sterling Hall negotiation would be my last act. He'd written, "Let her close the deal, then cut her loose." The optics would be perfect. Old making way for new. Right at the moment of triumph. That's when I understood. Victor didn't just want me gone, he wanted my erasure to be his coronation. The $1.9 billion deal would become his victory. My 15 years of relationship building forgotten in the headlines about Westmere's bold new direction. But Victor had made a crucial error, the kind they don't teach you at Harvard. He'd confused the appearance of power with power itself. He thought the signatures on those MOUs were just formalities, that CEOs were interchangeable parts in a corporate machine. He'd never spent Christmas Eve on the phone with the Norwegian executive's daughter, talking her through her first semester at university while her father was trapped in an airport. He'd never sat Shiva with the Israeli tech mogul's family. He'd never learned that the Dubai representative only drank tea from her grandmother's china pattern, and always noticed when someone remembered. These weren't just business relationships. They were architecture I'd built with patience, with sacrifice, with presence, and architecture, properly constructed, doesn't collapse when you remove the builder. It stands, and sometimes it fights back. The first warning came 6 weeks ago, disguised as corporate enthusiasm. "We need fresh perspectives on the international team," Victor announced during the Monday morning briefing. "Energy that matches our ambitious timeline." He smiled at me across the conference table, the kind of smile predators give prey they're still playing with. Then came the personnel changes. My deputy director, Sandra, who'd been with me for 8 years, was suddenly promoted to a special projects division that didn't exist 3 days earlier. Her replacement was a 26-year-old named Bradley who quoted Jack Welch and had "disruption evangelist" on his LinkedIn profile. He lasted 4 days before asking me to explain why we couldn't just Google Translate the contracts. The access restrictions followed. My security clearance for financial documents was mysteriously downgraded due to a system update. The corporate credit card I'd used for client entertainment was canceled for renewal processing that never completed. When I tried to book flights for the preliminary Sterling Hall meetings, I discovered my travel authorization had been revoked pending executive review. Marcus started working late, not because I asked him to, but because he sensed what I was beginning to understand. He'd forward me emails with cryptic subjects, calendar invitations I wasn't supposed to see. Thursday, 3 p.m., conference room. A. International Division Restructuring. Friday, 11 a.m., HR Confidential, Succession Planning. Each one another brick in the wall Victor was building around me. The most insidious change was the narrative. In meetings, Victor would credit my work to the team or to his new vision. The Istanbul contract I'd saved from collapse became his strategic intervention. The relationships I'd nurtured were reframed as legacy connections ready for modernization. He was rewriting history in real time, erasing me from my own story. 3 days before Sterling Hall, Marcus knocked on my office door at 9 p.m. His usually composed face showed something I'd rarely seen: urgency. "You need to see this," he said, placing his phone on my desk. It was a text thread between Victor's assistant and someone saved as KL Consult. Catherine Liu. I realized, an executive placement specialist known for surgical corporate transitions. The messages were clear. Replacement arriving Tuesday morning. Have security on standby. Make sure the conference room is full. We want witnesses to the changing of the guard. He's going to do it during the signing, Marcus said quietly. Maximum humiliation. Maximum impact. I stared at the messages, feeling something cold and precise click into place in my mind. He wants an audience. Isla, we should... Marcus. I looked up at him. Do you remember the Osaka situation? when Yamamoto-san nearly walked away because he felt disrespected by the previous management. You spent 6 hours in his office, going through old photo albums of his company's history. 8 hours. And do you know what he said at the end? Marcus shook his head. He said, Voss-san, a building's strength isn't in its newest floor, but in its foundation. Those who forget this build houses that collapse in the first storm. I pulled up the Sterling Hall MOUs on my secure laptop, the one IT didn't know about, purchased with my own funds, containing every crucial document from my 15 years at Westmere. Victor's reviewed these contracts 17 times. Do you know how many times he's actually read them? Based on his email patterns, none. He has Bradley summarize everything. And Bradley wouldn't know a diplomatic clause from a dinner menu. I scrolled through the dense legal text, finding the section I'd carefully crafted 6 months ago, when the first whispers of Victor's coup reached me. He's about to learn why details matter. The next morning, I watched Catherine Liu enter the building. Early 40s, severe bob. The kind of person who specialized in making terminations look like opportunities. She set up camp in the visitor's office 3 doors down from mine, close enough to be ready, far enough to avoid suspicion. Victor passed my office that afternoon, pausing at my door. Big day tomorrow, Isla. Your last deal for Westmere. Let's make it count. It will definitely be memorable, I replied, matching his smile with one of my own. He mistook my calm for defeat. Another error. When you've spent 15 years negotiating with people who could buy small countries, you learn that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who appears to have already lost. That night, I called each of the 12 CEOs personally. Not to warn them, that would have been crass, unprofessional. Just to confirm their attendance, to go over any last-minute concerns. In each conversation, I made sure to mention how much I valued our years of partnership, how grateful I was for their trust. Isla, the Norwegian executive said after a pause, is everything all right? Why do you ask, Eric? You sound like someone saying goodbye. Perhaps I am, I replied. But some goodbyes are really beginnings, don't you think? He was quiet for a moment. I'll see you tomorrow. And Isla? I always read the fine print, especially the parts others might miss. I hung up knowing that at least one person would be looking for what I'd hidden in plain sight. Sometimes that's all you need. One person paying attention when the show begins. 6 months ago, when the Sterling Hall negotiations were just beginning, I did something I'd never done in 15 years at Westmere. I played politics. The initial MOU draft was standard corporate boilerplate, the kind Bradley would have skimmed in 30 seconds and declared, good to go. But I knew Victor's patterns by then. His addiction to the appearance of control without the patience for actual detail. So I crafted something special. Buried in Section 7, Subsection 3. Under the innocuous heading, Mutual Commitments and Continuity Provisions. The Diplomatic Liaison Clause. In essence, it stated that all parties recognize the signatory coordinator, me, as an integral element of the agreement's validity. If the coordinator was removed or replaced prior to final execution, all preliminary agreements would require complete renegotiation with mandatory 180-day cooling-off period. It was wrapped in enough legal terminology to seem routine, positioned between standard force majeure provisions and liability limitations. The beauty was in how I'd presented it to each CEO individually, in their own language, both literal and figurative. To Yamamoto-san in Tokyo, I'd explained it as a matter of honor, a guarantee that the person who'd built the relationship would see it through. He'd nodded approvingly, recognizing the parallel to the lifetime employment principles his father's generation had valued. With Eric from Oslo, I'd framed it as risk mitigation. You know how American companies can be, I'd said during a private dinner. New leadership comes in, wants to renegotiate everything. This protects your position. He'd laughed, remembering 3 previous deals that had collapsed exactly that way. The Dubai representative, Amira, understood it as a trust mechanism. In her culture, personal relationships were business relationships. The clause ensured that the person she'd spent 2 years building trust with couldn't be arbitrarily replaced by a stranger. For the pharmaceutical executive from Zurich, Dr. Kellner, I'd used pure logic. It prevents last-minute destabilization tactics, I'd explained. Anyone wanting to sabotage the deal would target the coordinator first. This makes that strategy pointless. Each conversation was different, tailored to their concerns, their values, their fears, and each one had agreed, even insisted, that the clause was essential. When it came time for Victor's approval, I'd buried it in a stack of routine documentation on a Friday afternoon, knowing he had a golf tournament that weekend. His signature was hasty, impatient, the scrawl of a man who believed his real job was vision, not verification. All standard provisions, I assume, he'd asked, already reaching for his car keys. Industry standard, I'd replied, which wasn't technically a lie. It was standard in my industry, the industry of survival. But the clause was only half the protection. The second layer was more subtle, woven into the technical infrastructure of the deal itself. Every international MOU required digital authentication, a complex system of encrypted signatures that prevented tampering and verified identity. Standard practice was to use company-issued authentication keys, controlled by IT, accessible to senior leadership. But 3 months ago, during a routine security upgrade, I'd convinced our chief technology officer that we needed redundancy. What happens if the company servers are compromised during signing? I'd asked. We'd lose billions. He'd agreed to let me maintain a personal authentication device, a small encrypted key that looked like a standard USB drive but contained biometric locks tied to my fingerprints and retinal scan. It was registered with all 12 companies as the primary authentication method. With the company system listed as backup, Victor didn't know this. Bradley definitely didn't know this. The IT department knew but didn't understand the implications. As far as they were concerned, it was just another layer of security, the kind of overcautious redundancy I was known for. The key now sat in my jacket pocket, feeling heavier than its 15 grams should allow. Without it, the MOUs were just expensive paper. With it, I held $1.9 billion in my hand. The night before Sterling Hall, I'd created one final safeguard. I'd send each CEO's legal team a time-stamped email with a simple subject line, Authentication Protocol Reminder. The body contained technical instructions about the signing process, but embedded in the attachment was a full copy of the diplomatic liaison clause, highlighted and annotated. If anyone claimed they hadn't known, hadn't understood, there would be evidence otherwise. Marcus had watched me work, his expression moving from confusion to understanding to something like admiration. "You knew this was coming," he said. "You've known for months." "I suspected," I corrected. "In this business, you learn to build roads and bridges at the same time. You hope for bridges, but sometimes you need an exit." And if Victor had actually read the contracts? If he'd caught the clause? I'd smiled then, remembering something my grandmother used to say. She'd survived the Depression by hiding money in dozens of places, some obvious, some invisible. The obvious ones, she'd told me, are for them to find and feel clever. The real savings are in the places they'd never think to look. Then I would have found another way, I told Marcus. But Victor's fatal flaw isn't that he's careless. It's that he believes everyone else is. He thinks power means not having to pay attention to details. Tomorrow, he's going to learn that in international business, details are everything. As I left the office that night, I passed Catherine Liu in the lobby. She was on her phone, confirming tomorrow's transition procedure. Our eyes met briefly. She smiled, the professional smile of someone who specialized in other people's worst days. I smiled back, thinking of the USB key in my pocket, the clause in the contracts, the 12 CEOs who valued relationships over theater. Tomorrow, Victor would get his audience, but the show wouldn't end the way he'd scripted it. The USB key in my pocket was more than technology. It was 15 years of credibility condensed into encrypted silicon. As I stood there in Sterling Hall, watching Victor's theatrical confidence, I felt its weight against my ribs like a second heartbeat. The technical specifications were mundane on paper: AES 256 encryption, biometric dual authentication, quantum-resistant cryptography. But what they represented was anything but ordinary. This device held the digital DNA of every major transaction I'd shepherded through Westmere, each signature building upon the last, creating an unbreakable chain of trust that linked directly to me. 3 months earlier, when I'd proposed the personal authentication system, I'd presented it to our Chief Technology Officer, David Park, as a security enhancement. David was one of the few executives who still valued competence over politics. The standard corporate keys are vulnerable, I'd explained in his office, surrounded by screens showing network traffic patterns. If someone compromises our central servers during a critical signing, we lose everything, he'd finished, already seeing the implications. But personal keys create liability issues. If you leave the company, then you'll need to plan transitions properly, I'd said carefully. No more sudden departures. No more Friday afternoon terminations. Any transfer would require weeks of coordination with international partners. David had studied me then, his programmer's mind parsing the subtext. You're building a dead man's switch. I'm building continuity insurance, I'd corrected. The kind that protects everyone, the company, our partners, and yes, the person holding the key. The implementation had been meticulous. Each of the 12 companies received hardware that would only recognize my specific key for this transaction. Their security teams had my biometric data, not Westmere's, mine personally. The Swiss had been particularly thorough, sending their own team to verify my identity and encode my retinal pattern into their systems. Dr. Kellner from Zurich had overseen the process herself. In pharmaceuticals, she'd said, watching the technician scan my retina. We understand that some things cannot be replicated, a formula, yes, a process, perhaps. But the trust that comes from human verification, that's irreplaceable. The Japanese delegation had gone further, incorporating the authentication into their internal honor system. Yamamoto-san had formally registered me as a trusted intermediary in their corporate records, a designation that, in their business culture, was nearly impossible to revoke without cause. But the masterstroke was the synchronization protocol. All 12 keys had to authenticate within a 5-minute window, or the entire system would lock for 24 hours. It was presented as a security measure against staggered hostile takeovers, but it really meant that if my key wasn't present, nobody could sign anything. Victor, of course, had approved this along with dozens of other security measures, buried in IT budget meetings he considered beneath his attention. Catherine Liu, waiting in the wings to replace me, had no idea she was about to inherit a throne with no crown. The key itself was custom-built by a boutique firm in Tel Aviv, the same one that created authentication systems for international diamond traders. It had cost me $50,000 of my own money, my entire bonus from the Frankfurt deal. But it was worth it for one specific feature: the audit trail. Every time the key was used, it created an immutable record not just of the transaction, but of the circumstances, time, location, network conditions, even ambient temperature. More importantly, it recorded whether the authentication was voluntary. The biometric sensors could detect stress patterns, coercion indicators. If someone tried to force me to use it, the signature would be flagged as compromised. I'd tested this feature only once, during a demonstration for Eric from Oslo. I'd had Marcus pretend to pressure me while I authenticated a test document. The system immediately flagged it with warnings in red. Signature under duress. Verification required. Impressive, Eric had said. But why would you need such protection? Because, I'd replied, in our business, the most dangerous moment is often right after success. Now, standing in Sterling Hall with security waiting to escort me out, I touched the key through my jacket fabric. The metal was warm from my body heat, familiar as a wedding ring I no longer wore. Victor was still talking, explaining to the room how my replacement would ensure a seamless transition. Catherine Liu had apparently entered the building, ready to take my place at the table. But she didn't have my retinal pattern. She didn't have my fingerprints. And she certainly didn't have the trust of 12 CEOs who'd spent years watching me prove that their interests were my interests. The Norwegian executive, Eric, was looking at his phone, likely reviewing the authentication protocol reminder I'd sent last night. Dr. Kellner had her tablet open to what I recognized as the signature verification screen. The Japanese delegation was having a quiet conference, Yamamoto-san's expression increasingly grave. Mr. Langford, Amira from Dubai spoke suddenly, her voice cutting through Victor's monologue. I need clarification on the authentication process. My security team is asking about the primary key holder. Victor paused, irritation flashing across his face. A minor technical detail. Our IT department has full control. No. Dr. Kellner interrupted, her Swiss precision sharp as a scalpel. According to our records, the primary authentication is personally held. By Ms. Voss? The room's attention shifted to me. I stood by the door, security guard hovering uncertainly beside me, my hand resting on the pocket containing $1.9 billion worth of leverage. That's correct, I said calmly. The key is biometrically locked, personal and non-transferable. Victor's face went through a transformation, confusion, understanding, then the beginning of rage, all in the span of 3 seconds. That's a company asset. You'll surrender it immediately. Actually, I replied, pulling out my phone to show the authentication certificate. It's personally registered, purchased with my own funds, insured under my name. The company is listed as a beneficiary of its use, not its owner. Your legal team approved this structure, I interrupted, pulling up the email chain. You personally signed off on it, Mr. Langford, April 15th, 3:47 p.m. You said, and I quote, "Whatever keeps the deal secure, just handle it." The silence that followed was perfect, not empty, but full of the sound of shifted leverage, of power changing hands without a single physical movement. I held the key to everything Victor wanted, and he'd given it to me himself. The transformation of Sterling Hall's atmosphere was almost physical, like watching ice form across a lake, starting from the edges and working inward. I walked back from the door, each step deliberate, and set my portfolio back on the table. The security guard, torn between his orders and the shifting dynamics, remained frozen by the entrance. Gentlemen, ladies, I addressed the room, ignoring Victor entirely. We have a decision to make. We can proceed with the signatures now, with the authenticated protocols we've established over the past 6 months. Or we can postpone, which, according to Section 7, Subsection 3 of our agreement, triggers a mandatory 180-day renegotiation period. Eric from Oslo was the first to move. He closed his portfolio with a decisive snap. I need to consult with my board about this. Unexpected leadership change. As do I, Yamamoto-san added, his team already packing their documents with practiced efficiency. In Japan, we have a saying, a house divided cannot shelter anyone from the storm. Victor's carefully constructed composure cracked. This is ridiculous. She's been terminated. You'll work with her replacement. Will we? Dr. Kellner interrupted, her tone clinical. Mr. Langford, my company has invested 18 months in this negotiation based on specific relationship guarantees. You've just violated those guarantees in the most public manner possible. The diplomatic liaison clause, Amira said, reading from her tablet. It's quite clear. Any change in the primary coordinator prior to final execution nullifies the preliminary agreements. She looked up at Victor. Did you read this before signing? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Victor's jaw worked silently, his eyes darting between the exits and the CEOs who were now standing, gathering their things with synchronized disappointment. This is corporate sabotage, Victor sputtered, pointing at me. She's manipulated all of you. No. The Israeli tech mogul, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. She protected us from exactly this kind of instability. He turned to me. Isla, I assume you'd be willing to complete the signatures if Mr. Langford reconsidered his hasty decision. It was a lifeline thrown to Victor, a chance to back down, to salvage the deal. But I knew him well enough to predict his response. His ego wouldn't allow retreat, especially not in front of an audience he'd assembled for his triumph. "She's terminated," Victor repeated, his voice rising. "And if you walk away from this deal because of some administrative technicality, you'll be walking away from Westmere Global entirely." The threat landed like a lead balloon. These weren't small companies that needed Westmere. They were giants who'd chosen to work with us because of carefully cultivated relationships. Victor had just revealed he didn't understand the fundamental equation. The pharmaceutical executive from Zurich actually laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Mr. Langford, my company's annual revenue is 3 times Westmere's market capitalization. We don't respond to threats. We respond to trust. And you've just demonstrated you don't understand the difference." One by one, they filed toward the door. Each stopped briefly at my position. A nod from Eric, a slight bow from Yamamoto-san, a hand on my shoulder from Amira. They were acknowledging what Victor couldn't, that I was the deal. Not the paper, not the company logo, not the theatrical power plays. "Wait!" Victor's voice cracked with desperation. "The board will hear about this. You're destroying shareholder value over personal loyalty." "No," I said quietly. But everyone heard me. "You destroyed it the moment you thought you could replace trust with authority." Catherine Liu appeared in the doorway, her professional smile faltering as she watched the exodus of executives. She held a tablet and a fresh portfolio, the props for a role she'd never get to play. "Mr. Langford," she ventured uncertainly. "Should I—" "Get out!" Victor snarled, his composure finally shattering completely. "Everyone just get out." But we were already leaving, the CEOs, their entourages. And I moved through Sterling Hall's corridor like a funeral procession for a deal that had died of self-inflicted wounds. Behind us, I could hear Victor on his phone, his voice alternating between rage and pleading as he tried to reach board members to explain how $1.9 billion had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. In the elevator, Eric stood beside me. "You knew this would happen." "I prepared for it to happen," I corrected. "There's a difference." What will you do now?" I pulled the USB key from my pocket, holding it up to the light. Such a small thing to hold so much power. "First, I'm going to return this to the 12 of you, with instructions for your legal teams about the contract nullification. Then—" I paused, thinking of the offers that would come. The companies that would want someone who could build and protect relationships like I had. "Then I'm going to take a vacation. My first in 5 years." The elevator doors opened to the lobby, where Marcus waited with a banker's box of my personal items and a smile that said he'd been watching the security feeds. "The board's already calling an emergency meeting," he informed me quietly. Victor's assistant accidentally copied me on the panic email. Through the glass doors, I could see the convoy of executive cars waiting to carry away $1.9 billion in opportunity. Each one represented years of my life, sacrifices that had seemed worthwhile when building something meaningful. But I'd learned something important. You can't protect what you build by giving others the power to destroy it. Sometimes, the best security system isn't in preventing the attack. It's in ensuring that the attacker loses more than you do. "Ms. Voss." Yamamoto-san approached before entering his car. "When you're ready to discuss new opportunities, you have my direct line." Similar offers would come from the others, I knew. But for now, I just wanted to walk out of Sterling Hall carrying nothing but a small USB key and the satisfaction of watching Victor Langford learn that in international business, as in architecture, the foundation always outlasts the facade. The unraveling happened faster than even I had anticipated. Within 3 minutes of the CEOs leaving the conference room, Victor's kingdom began its collapse. I stood in the Sterling Hall lobby, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as the executive convoys departed one by one. Marcus held my banker's box, while I observed Victor through the security monitor at the reception desk. The guard, sympathetic to my situation, had angled the screen so I could see. Victor was pacing the conference room, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing wildly at empty chairs. His voice, though muted by distance and glass, carried the sharp pitch of desperation. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, showing me his phone. "You need to see this." The email chain was from Westmere's chief legal officer to the board, marked, "Urgent, contract failure imminent." The timestamp showed it was sent 2 minutes ago. News traveled fast in corporate disasters. Through the window, I saw Dr. Kellner's car pause at the exit. Her window rolled down, and she spoke briefly to her driver before the car reversed back toward the building. She emerged, phone in hand, walking with purpose toward the lobby. "Isla," she said, approaching me directly. "My board is asking for immediate clarification. Can you confirm that the authentication key remains valid only with your biometric input?" "That's correct," I replied, pulling up the technical specifications on my phone. "Any attempt to override or duplicate it will trigger a complete lockout. The system will consider it a security breach." She nodded, typing rapidly. "And the diplomatic liaison clause, there's no workaround?" "None. Each company countersigned it individually. It would require unanimous consent from all 12 parties to modify, and that consent must be given in person, not electronically. Which means Mr. Langford would need to gather everyone again." She looked back at the now empty street. "After this display, that seems unlikely." Behind us, the elevator dinged. Catherine Liu emerged, her professional composure cracking as she spotted me. She hesitated, then approached. "Ms. Voss?" She began carefully. "I want you to know I had no idea about the technical requirements. I was told it would be a standard transition." "I know," I said, surprising her. "Victor doesn't brief his replacements. He just positions them and hopes momentum will carry the rest." She glanced back at the elevator, then leaned closer. "He's on with the board now. They're not happy." The phrase catastrophic leadership failure has been used repeatedly. Through the security monitor, I watched Victor slam his phone onto the conference table. The device bounced, skittered across the polished surface, and fell to the floor. He stood there, hands braced on the table, shoulders heaving. "The Oslo group just sent formal notification," Marcus announced, reading from his phone. "They're withdrawing from negotiations, citing fundamental concerns about Westmere's leadership stability and commitment to partnership integrity." The dominoes were falling exactly as I'd anticipated. Each CEO had their own board to answer to, their own shareholders to protect. They couldn't afford to be associated with a deal that had imploded so spectacularly, so publicly. "Excuse me, Ms. Voss?" The security guard who'd been sent to escort me out approached hesitantly. "I've been told to, that is, Mr. Langford wants to know if you'd be willing to return to the conference room." "To discuss what?" I asked. He said to tell you he's ready to reconsider the termination." I looked at the guard, Raymond. I remembered, father of 2, night school student working toward his degree. "Raymond, do you know what happens when you try to unfire a gun?" He smiled slightly. "Nothing good, ma'am." "Exactly." I handed him my building access card. "Tell Mr. Langford that my consulting rates are $5,000 per hour, with a minimum engagement of 40 hours. If he'd like to discuss transition services, he can have legal draft a proper contract." Raymond's smile widened. "Yes, ma'am." "Word for word?" "Word for word." My phone buzzed. Yamamoto-san's direct line. I answered immediately. "Voss-san." His voice was formal but warm. "I've just spoken with the other 11 parties. We're prepared to resume negotiations, but under new terms. We'd like to contract directly with you as an independent coordinator. Would you consider this?" Behind me, I heard the elevator ding again. Victor emerged, his tie askew, his perfect hair disheveled. He saw me across the lobby and started forward. "But doctor." Kellner stepped into his path. "Mr. Langford," she said coolly, "I believe you have a board meeting to attend. We'll be in touch about the contract penalties for failed negotiations. Section 12 is quite specific about the compensation required when deals collapse due to preventable executive actions." Victor's face went from red to white. The penalty clauses, another detail he hadn't read. Each company could claim preparation costs, travel expenses, and projected opportunity losses. It would total in the millions. "This is her fault," he said, pointing at me. "She sabotaged. She protected our interests." Eric interrupted, having returned to the lobby. "Which was her job. You, on the other hand, attempted to use our partnership as a stage for your authority. That, Mr. Langford, is actual sabotage." The board would see it the same way. Victor had taken a sure thing and destroyed it for ego, for show, for the kind of power display that belonged in a different century. The loss wouldn't just be the $1.9 billion deal, it would be Westmere's reputation in the international market. "Ms. Voss," Victor called out, his voice cracking, "please, we can work this out." I turned to face him fully, letting him see the calm he'd mistaken for defeat. "No, Mr. Langford, we can't. You made your choice. You wanted an audience for it. Now you have to live with it." The elevator arrived again. This time, it was Westmere's chairman of the board, Robert Sterling. Yes, the Sterling of Sterling Hall, old money and older principles. He surveyed the scene, Victor disheveled and desperate, the CEOs gathered like witnesses at an accident, me standing with my banker's box and my dignity intact. "Ms. Voss," he said quietly, "I apologize for this unprecedented situation. Would you be available to discuss options for remediation? My consulting rates are whatever you require." He cut in smoothly, then turned to Victor. "Mr. Langford, the board is convening in the executive conference room. Your presence is required. Immediately." Victor looked between us, understanding finally dawning. He'd thought he was the king removing a troublesome advisor. Instead, he'd been the jester who'd just performed his last act. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of notifications. Marcus stood beside me in Sterling Hall's lobby, reading updates from his phone with barely suppressed satisfaction. "Tokyo's legal team just sent formal notice of withdrawal," he reported. Dubai followed 3 minutes later. "The Zurich group is demanding a written explanation for the gross mismanagement of confidential negotiations." Each message was another nail in Victor's professional coffin. But I felt no joy in it, only a cold, clean sense of completion, like finishing a complex equation that had taken months to solve. Robert Sterling returned to the lobby, his face grave, but his eyes holding something that might have been respect. "Ms. Voss, the board has terminated Mr. Langford's employment, effective immediately. We'd like to discuss your immediate reinstatement, with a significant promotion and compensation adjustment." "I'm no longer interested in employment with Westmere," I said simply, "but I'll help you salvage what's left of these relationships. As an independent consultant," he nodded slowly, "name your terms. $5,000 per hour, 40-hour minimum engagement, plus 2% of any deals successfully recovered. And I wanted in writing that Westmere will never again attempt to terminate someone during active negotiations." "Done." Behind him, I saw Victor being escorted out by security, the same security he'd summoned for me. He carried his own banker's box now, his Harvard MBA certificate visible on top, his executive nameplate catching the light. Our eyes met briefly. In his, I saw the dawning understanding of how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "You knew," he said, stopping despite security's gentle pressure to keep moving. "You knew I'd do this." "I knew you'd try," I corrected. The when and how were variables. The outcome was always constant. "This isn't over." "Yes," I said firmly. "It is." Security led him away, out into the bright afternoon where no executive car waited, where no assistant stood ready with his schedule. He'd wanted to be remembered. He would be as a cautionary tale told in business schools about the danger of confusing theater with power. Over the next 3 days, I worked 18-hour shifts from a suite in Sterling Hall, rebuilding what Victor had destroyed. Each CEO required personal attention, careful diplomacy, and ironclad guarantees. The USB key that had been my shield became my sword, cutting through bureaucracy and establishing new protocols that protected everyone's interests. Yamamoto-san was the first to sign the restructured agreement. "Boss-san," he said during our video call, "in Japan, we have a concept called nin, endurance with dignity. You have shown this." Eric from Oslo signed next, adding a personal note. "Next time, warn us you're setting a trap. We'd have brought popcorn." One by one, they returned, not to Westmere, but to me. The new structure made me an independent coordinator, contracted by all parties simultaneously. I'd never again be vulnerable to a single person's ego or a single company's politics. The final signature came from Dr. Seens, Kellner in Zurich. "The Swiss appreciate precision," she said, reviewing the documents. "What you did was precise in a way our best clockmakers would admire." The deals were restructured at $2.1 billion, higher than before, because the companies now insisted on additional protections and guarantees that only I could provide. Westmere would get their commission, but I would get my percentage, and more importantly, my freedom. On my last day in Sterling Hall, I stood in the same conference room where Victor had tried to destroy me. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting golden rectangles on the table where 12 signatures now sealed a better deal than the one he'd killed. Marcus knocked and entered. "Your car's here. Also, I've had 7 job offers this week, all from companies that heard what you did." "And?" "I told them I already have a job. Your new consulting firm needs a chief of operations, doesn't it?" I smiled, my first real smile in months. "It does. Same terms as before. Better terms. I've learned from watching you, never accept the first offer, and always get it in writing." As I left Sterling Hall for the last time, I carried no banker's box, no corporate property, no company devices, just my personal phone, my leather portfolio, and the USB key that had changed everything. The security guard, Raymond, held the door for me. "Ms. Voss, my daughter's studying business at the State University. When I told her what happened here, she said you're already being discussed in her corporate ethics class." "Nah, what are they saying?" "That sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy. It's letting them destroy themselves while you hold the door open." I stepped out into the city afternoon, feeling the weight of 15 years lifting from my shoulders. My phone buzzed with messages from companies wanting to hire me, from former colleagues offering congratulations, from journalists wanting the story. I ignored them all. Victory doesn't need an audience. It only needs to be complete. The USB key in my pocket felt lighter now. No longer a weapon or a shield, just a tool. But I'd learned something valuable. In a world of paper tigers and loud voices, real power is quiet, patient, and always reads the fine print. I walked away from Sterling Hall, from Westmere, from Victor's wreckage, my heels clicking on pavement in a rhythm that sounded like freedom. Behind me, the building's windows reflected the sunset, turning everything golden, even the ruins of an ego that had tried to burn me down. He'd wanted to teach me a lesson about power. Instead, he'd learned one about preparation. And somewhere in that building, 12 signed contracts worth $2.1 billion bore my signature. Not as an employee, not as a subordinate, but as the person who'd built something that couldn't be destroyed by anyone except herself. The best revenge, I'd learned, isn't served cold. It's served with perfect documentation and witnesses who matter. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and strategic patience. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of workplace justice, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about Isla's calculated counterstrike. What would you have done in her position? Let me know in the comments.